like you to turn this morning to the book of Mark. That's the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 12. And I'd like to speak on the topic this morning of the afterlife and a grand conspiracy. The afterlife and a grand conspiracy. We'll start by reading from the book of Mark, chapter 12. Let's start reading from verse 18. This portion of scripture they're reading here right here will be where our main thoughts are coming from. Mark chapter 12, verse 18. Then come unto him the Sadducees, and the Sadducees which say there is no resurrection. And they asked him, saying, Master, Moses wrote unto us, if a man's brother die and leave his wife behind, and leave no children, that his brother should take his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. Now there were 7 brethren, and the first took a wife, and dying left no seed. And the second took her and died, neither left he any seed. And the third likewise. And the 7 had her and left no seed. Last of all, the woman died also. And here's their question to Jesus, the Sadducees to Jesus. In the resurrection, therefore, when they shall rise, whose wife shall she be of them? For the 7 had her to wife. And Jesus answering said unto them, Do ye not therefore err, because ye know not the Scriptures, neither the power of God? For when they shall rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels which are in heaven. And as touching the dead that they rise, have ye not read in the book of Moses, specifically, I think it was Exodus 4, how in the bush God gave unto him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Ye therefore do greatly err. Now the Sadducees were a sect, subdivision of the Jews. We say the Jews is this big circle, and a portion of them, a smaller portion, were the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection as we just read. They don't believe in an afterlife. And we compare them to the Pharisees. The Pharisees were also a sect or division of the Jews, but the Pharisees did believe in the afterlife, and they believed in angelic beings such as angels. And we'll get into a little bit more about the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and also the scribes and the chief priests. We'll get into that because they're all involved in this grand conspiracy. But as you see, the Sadducees did not believe in the afterlife. Now, most cultures throughout history, most of them, believed in some kind of afterlife. For instance, the Egyptians had the Book of the Dead, and they believed in an afterlife. In fact, one of their pharaohs had buried with him in a tomb a solar boat so that he could sail to the afterlife, right? Now the Greeks, that believed in the myths, they believed in the afterlife, and when they were buried with a coin in their mouths, so that after they died, they'd have something to pay the boatmen to cross the river Styx so they could go to the afterlife. The American Indians, a lot of them were buried with their bows and arrows and spears and their ponies so that they would have something to ride and to hunt with in the afterlife. And so many cultures had these theories of what happened in the afterlife, and they believed in the afterlife. Sadducees did not. Of course, our modern day atheists do not believe in an afterlife. They believe when you die, that's it. You expire. They believe you in expiation, you're just no more, right? You're dead all over like the old dog Rover, and that's it. That's the end of it. Now Ben Franklin was not you wouldn't call him an avid churchgoer. He was not an avid church, but he believed in the afterlife, and he actually believed in the resurrection. To this day, you can go to see his grave in Philadelphia through a gate, but you can see it. And he was buried about 12 years after his dear wife died. He was buried beside her. And I think the only thing the grave says is Ben Franklin and the name of his wife. And that's it. That's it. But earlier in his life, Franklin, he was a prodigy. I think he owned a couple of businesses when he was 14 years old. We think 14-year-olds can't do anything. He was running 2 businesses. He was a printer. He was known as a printer of one is the Philadelphia Gazette, and the other one was Poor Richard's Almanac. He was known as a printer. So when he was younger and had those jobs, he wrote an epitaph for himself, something that could be carved into his headstone. And the epitaph read this way. Now, he never used it, but he composed it for himself when he was younger. It says, "Here lies the body of Benjamin Franklin, printer. Parenthesis, like the cover of an old book, its contents worn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding. So here lies the body of Benjamin Franklin. He lies here, food for worms!" Exclamation point. "Yet the work itself shall not be lost." Listen to this. "For it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more beautiful edition, corrected and amended by its author." It's pretty good, isn't it? It's pretty good. So old Ben Franklin, who didn't go to church much, believed in the afterlife, and he believed, as we read here, he certainly believed in the resurrection. But the Sadducees did not. So let's get to the grand conspiracy before we talk about the afterlife, according to the Sadducees. If we go to the beginning of Mark chapter 12, let's read verses 12 through 13. Matthew chapter 12, verses 12 through 13. And the scripture says, "And they sought to lay hold of him, but feared the people, for they knew that he had spoken the parable against them. And they left him and went their way. And they sent unto him certain of the Pharisees and of the Herodians to catch him in his words." As good as I do, in every conspiracy, there's a they, right? They. And when you question somebody that believes in a conspiracy, you always say, well, who are the they? Right? And sometimes they don't have an answer for that. Well, it's they, them. No, I don't know. Tell me who they is. And sometimes if it's a legitimate conspiracy, you can name them or they. And we can name them or they here in the context. But in order to identify those that started the conspiracy, we'll have to go back to Mark chapter 11. In Mark chapter 11, packed full of information for us, we see that some great events happen. Jesus has neared the end of his 3.5-year ministry. And he is about to make his grand entrance into Jerusalem and come in to be proclaimed king, right? Because he was king. He is king. And he was going to do it in a very unusual way. He was going to, of course, fulfill Scripture of the Old Testament by doing so and come into Jerusalem on a colt. Look at Mark chapter 11, verse 7. And they brought the colt to Jesus and cast his garments on him, and he sat upon him. They cast his garments, so they made a makeshift saddle for him. He got up on the colt. And many spread their garments in the way, and others cut down branches of trees and strawed them in the way. And they that went before him and they that followed cried, saying, Hosanna! Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. This is the crowd. This is the crowd yelling. Blessed be the kingdom of our father David that cometh in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And Jesus entered into Jerusalem, and into first place he goes where is the temple. Jesus entered the Jerusalem and into the temple. And when he had looked around about upon all these things, and now the eventide was come, he went out into Bethany with the 12 apostles. So he went into this temple. Of course, this is the second temple that was built. First one was destroyed. Second temple. And it was one of the wonders of the world. Remember, the apostles couldn't wait to show Jesus the temple and how grand it was. So Jesus goes in the temple, and he doesn't do anything, and he leaves. He goes back to Bethany. He spends the night. In the morrow, he comes right back into Jerusalem, and what does he do? Verse 15, and they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. And he taught, saying unto them, It is not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. So this very famous scene of Jesus seeing them selling and buying and trading in the temple, and they've desecrated the temple, making it a den of thieves, not just a house of merchandise, but evidently some fraud and deceit was going on as well. And he kicks them all out of the temple. And this is this is a miracle in and of itself, because this is, the week of festivals here. There's lots of people in the temple, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, and he kicks them all out. This son of a carpenter, right? That's not very impressive looking physically. Remember Isaiah's description of him? It's not very impressive physically. That wasn't what was special about him. What was special about him is that inside was the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he goes there and kicks them all out. Now, is there going to be anybody upset by this? Yes, there are. Now we're going to identify the beginners of the conspiracy. Look at verse 18. And the scribes and the chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his doctrine. Here's the conspiracy starting. What's the foundation of the conspiracy? The scribes and the chief priests. Now, who are scribes? Who are scribes? When you think of a scribe, you think of somebody who just sort of writes down things. That was part of their job. They actually wrote down copies of the first 5 books of Moses and other legal documents. They did that. But they're also teachers. They explored some of the heavier meanings of the law, right? They were looked up to as teachers, and they're higher up in the echelon of the hierarchy there in Israel. They were looked up to. So notice that the scribes and the chief priests are mentioned together. Chief priests, we don't have to speculate. We know that's the priests of the temple. Now, what you need to know, I talked to you about the scribes and the Pharisees. the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a smaller sect, but yet they might have been a little bit more influential than the Pharisees. See, the Pharisees were like blue-collar guys. They were middle-class guys, and there were the ones that added to the law. Remember these fences around the law added to the law, so they made sure no one broke the law. And, the Apostle Paul was a Pharisee. They were part of this sect. They were larger, and they were part of the middle class. But Sadducees were the richer, sort of more, they're like aristocracy, more of the rulers. Even though they were smaller, they controlled the seats of power. See, they were the ones, I've read that they were the ones who determined who would be the priests in the temple. The Sadducees would. And they're also in control of the Sanhedrin. What was the Sanhedrin? I've told you before. It's like the Supreme Court of Israel at that time. The Supreme Court in the Old Testament, or in this part of the New Testament. And if you had a case, it went all up to them, and they decided it. They're also a governmental body. They governed somewhat the people as well. So you can see the Sadducees had a lot of political power. They controlled the priesthood. They controlled the Sanhedrin. And so that's that. And then the Pharisees. But then on the top of the heap, you had these scribes and chief priests. So in verse 18, he says, "And the scribes and the chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him." Not just kill him, but destroy him. They hated him so much, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his doctrine. At this time, Jesus Christ had the crowd. He had the populace, right? All right. So, go to verse 27 in Mark chapter 11. Verse 27. And it says, and here it says, "And they come again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, there come to him the chief priests and the scribes and the elders." The elders are just others that were people in government that had, but the government, you understand, Jerusalem at this, the Jews at this time were theocracies, so the government, it's not like ours, separation of religion and government. It was religion and government all mixed together. So the elders were part of the government. They are part of the religion as well. "And say unto him, By what authority doest thou these things?" So here come the beginners of the conspiracy, the scribes and the chief priests, and they come to him and come to Jesus and say, by what authority? See, we're the people in charge here, and you're just the son of a carpenter, no-name person. The crowd seem to be following you. You talk with such confidence and authority like you're one of the ruling body, but you're not, we are. So where do you get your authority? And saying, "By what authority doest thou these things, and who gavest thee this authority to do these things? We demand to know." And Jesus answered and said to them, he says, "I'll answer your question if you answer one question I give you." Right? That's Jesus. So I got a question for you. "I will also ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or of men? Answer me." He said, "Answer me." And the chief priests and the scribes, they huddle together and say, "Well, if we say the baptism of John was of God, then he's going to say, well, why didn't you proclaim John a great prophet and follow him? If we say it was of man, see, the crowds are on Jesus' side, and we fear, alienating the crowd, our supporters. So we're in a conundrum. What do we do here?" So they reasoned themselves, and they answered, verse 33, "And they answered and said unto Jesus, We cannot tell." They came to corner Jesus, and Jesus cornered them. So they couldn't give an answer. So they said, "We cannot tell you." And his answer said, "Neither do I tell you by what authority I do these things." So do you think this made them angrier? I think they were a little bit angrier. And now we get to Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. And it says, "And he began to speak unto them." Who's them? By the parables. He's talking about the scribes and the chief priests, right? He's telling them, but of course other people are listening as well. But he's directing it at them. And you're familiar with this parable. A certain man planted a vineyard and set an hedge about it and digged a place with a wine fat and built a tower. He built a business. And then he let it out. He rented it out to husbandmen, people, managers. They can manage the business. And he would just come by and take his percentage because he started the business. They ran it. He gets his percentage. So the man that built the vineyard, he sends somebody over there to collect his money. Guess what these husbands do? They kill him. And he sends another. And they injure him or kill him too. And they send another and they kill him. And the owner says, "Well, I'll send my son. Certainly they're not going to hurt my son. They will respect him." And he sent his son. And guess what they did to the son? Same thing they did to the other people they sent. Now, this is a parable, so you remember what a parable is. It's a similitude. It's something that happens in real life, but it's there to teach you that something is similar in spiritual truth. So the owner, who's the owner? Isn't that don't you think that's God? God created this world, and God sent lots of prophets to the people, and guess what the people did? You killed them all, and the chief priests and the scribes are listening to this parable, and they say, "Wait a minute, he's talking about us," And then God sent His own Son to them, and they killed the Son. And they said, "Well, Jesus hadn't died yet, right?" Jesus is telling the parable, but they can't understand the parable. Remember, Jesus Christ preached in parables because He didn't want people to understand what He was talking about. He wanted His people to understand what He was talking about. That's the reason He spoke only in parables at one point in His ministry. They didn't understand, but they knew enough to know He's talking about me. And I think that made them a little mad and even more angrier. So what happened? Verse 12, look at Matthew chapter 12, verse 12. "And they," who's they? It's the chief priests and the scribes. "And they sought to lay hold on him, but feared the people. For they knew that he had spoken the parable against them, and they left him and went their way." They are really frustrated. But what is a conspiracy, by the way? How do you define that? That's two or more people get together and agree to commit a crime. The conspiracy is the agreement to commit the crime. That's what it is. So they want to destroy Jesus. That's the crime, destroy him. So they want to enlist help. So what do they do in verse 13? They went away, but they said, "Let's get him anyway." Verse 13, "And they send unto him certain of the Pharisees and of the Herodians to catch him in his words." So now they confederate with the Pharisees to go after Jesus Christ. These Pharisees, they think they're really smart. They can think of something. We failed, but they can think of something, to catch him in. So they tell the Pharisees huddle up, they get together, and they say, how do we catch him? How do we discredit him in front of the people, Sort of like, what people do when they're planning for a debate. What can I say to the other person to catch him or her in this thought and expose them, in front of the people that are watching the debate. This is what they're trying to do. So they come up with this really brilliant one. And they always, are slimy. Because what do the Sadducees do when they come up to Jesus? What do they say? Master? They didn't think he was a master. They didn't think he was a teacher. They didn't like him. But they wanted to butter him up in front of the people. It's all so deceitful, right? And so what do the Pharisees do? Verse 14. And when they were come, they say unto him, Master, they call him Master, we know that thou art true, and carest for no man, for thou regardest not the person of men, but teachest the way of God in truth. And here's their question. Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? We really got him now. Because the Jews, rightly so under the law, did not have much to do with Gentiles because they were not part of God's chosen people. They were not under, the ceremonial law and the law of the Old Testament. And they did not associate with them, they didn't mix with them, and they certainly didn't want them in authority over them, but they were. It was the Roman Gentile government that was over the Jewish people. And they hated it, right? Right. Now, one of Jesus' apostles was Matthew, and Matthew was what? What was his job? That's right, he's a tax collector. Now, Matthew was a Jew, but he collected taxes not for the Jewish government, for the Roman government. And so Matthew, as a tax collector, and his kind were hated by the Jewish people because they were stealing God's money in order to give it to the Gentile government. And that's the reason people would make fun of Jesus and say, look at him over there. He's eating, what's he eating with? He's sharing a meal with tax collectors. These people, this hated people. And also harlots. Tax collectors and harlots were on the same level, right? And it was, we don't give money to the Gentiles, right? So, but the question is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Shall we give or shall we not give? They got him now. Because if they say not give because it's against the law as I understand it, then they can report him to the Gentiles. He says, he's teaching people not to pay their taxes. Go get him. If he says, yes, pay taxes, then they can say, look, he's betrayed the Jewish people and our religion by saying we have to give money to Caesar. Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Shall we give or shall we not give? But he, knowing their hypocrisy, and said to them, why tempt you? Why tempt me? You see, you're trying to tempt me to sin. You're not going to succeed, but you're trying. He says, bring me a penny that I may see it. And they brought it. And he said to them, who is this image and superscription? And they said unto him, Caesar's. Caesar's image is on there. Jesus answered and said to them, render to Caesar's the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. He silenced them. So the Pharisees and the Herodians had to walk away, heads dipped in shame. They failed. They were part of the conspiracy, but they failed. So then, it's not specifically stated, but it's probably, if not directed, it was suggested probably by the chief priests and the scribes to the Sadducees. The Pharisees failed. It's you're up next. Go next. So the Sadducees, they go to him and they say, we really got him. And the scripture I just read to you this morning, they say, well, they don't believe in that. They don't believe in the resurrection, right? So they're going to catch him in these terms. He says, Master, Moses, they call him Master. Master, Moses wrote unto us. Moses wrote what? if a man's brother die and leave his wife behind and leave no children, that his brother should take his wife and raise up seed into his brother. And they're quoting from, I believe it's Deuteronomy chapter 20. That's part of the law. And this is, you're familiar with this law because this happened to Ruth, right? Ruth married her near kinsman, the near kinsman of her deceased husband, and raised his name, and inheritance rights continued. So they're quoting from Deuteronomy, and he says, if a man's brother die and leave his wife behind and leave no children, then his brother should take his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. Now there were 7 brethren. The first took a wife and dying left no seed. The second did so. Third, fourth, seventh. All 7 brothers married her, as the law said, because they wanted to have a child with her so that it would resurrect the name of the dead brother, and inheritance and the money stayed in the family. This was the purpose of the law. But they say, but 7 brothers married her, died, leaving no children. Then she died. So, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And I think this is important for us in many ways. Number one, Jesus Christ is going to prove that the resurrection and the afterlife is real, right? And he's going to teach us certain things about the afterlife. Now, we talked about the Indians, American Indians, when they died. When they died, they took their bows and arrows, their spears and their ponies, and they buried them all together so that when they go to the happy hunting ground in the afterlife, they can just resume their life like it was before. They can start hunting with their pony, and it's just another life, right? But Jesus is trying to teach us that the afterlife is not going to be like our life right now. If you're thinking heaven is going to be just like you're experiencing now on earth, in heaven, you're mistaken. As Jesus says, you err not knowing the scriptures. Now, we think that, when we get up, we'll have the same father and mother and sons and daughters and husbands and wives, and all these people will be there, right? But the relationships are going to be totally different. See, because Jesus is the focus of heaven. The only relationship that will really matter in heaven is our relationship to Jesus Christ. Does that mean we won't know each other? Some people teach that. I don't see how they get that. Remember, Jesus Christ goes up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and he takes, I think, Peter, James, and John with him. And they're witnesses of this. And suddenly, Jesus' body shows bright as the sun. And it's a preview of what the resurrection is going to look like, right? His resurrected body. But there's also a couple other guys there. There's Elias and Moses. And they're talking together. And I don't think they're saying, hey, who are you? They actually talk to each other like they know each other. So are we going to know each other in heaven? We certainly will know each other. Will our relationships in heaven be exactly the same? They will not. They will be better. Our relationships with each other are going to be supremely better because there's not going to be any sin out there. No sin up there. And our relationship as a whole will be supremely better because we are related to Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God. That's what's important about the afterlife. And so the Sadducees that don't believe in the resurrection, they believe, sort of like the American Indian, that life will continue like it is now up in heaven. And Jesus is trying to inform them, no, it's going to be different. It's going to be different. Now, verse 24, Jesus answering said unto them, do ye not therefore err, because ye know not the Scriptures, neither the power of God? Now, I've read the Sadducees only believed in the first five books of the Bible, what's called the Pentateuch, the Talmud, and they didn't believe in the oral traditions of the Pharisees. Now, obviously, they weren't really students of and believers of the prophets, because there's plenty of prophecies there that tell us that there will be an afterlife and there will be a resurrection. So Jesus says, you do err not knowing the Scriptures. So therefore, your error is in the Scriptures and the truth, right? Second of all, he says you err because you don't know the power of God. So do you believe that God has the power to transform us? Not exchange our bodies, but change our bodies and be bright as the sun, not to be like something terrestrial on earth. Remember, he talks in 1 Corinthians 15, not terrestrial, but extraterrestrial, like the stars in heaven. That's what we're going to look like in the resurrection of the dead. It can't be described in words. It's going to be unbelievable what we are going to be like in the resurrection. But they didn't believe in the resurrection. They erred not knowing the Scriptures, and they erred not knowing the power of God that could actually do that. Remember, God says, my word will not return to me void. It's not empty. If I say, Lazarus, come forth, he's going to come forth. If I say, rise from the grave, the children of God will rise from the grave in the morning of the resurrection. You don't know the power of God. Verse 25, for when they shall, Jesus just takes it for granted that the resurrection is true. He says, for when they shall rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels which are in heaven. So when we depart, we go up to heaven, and we're like these immortal spiritual beings like the angels. But unlike the angels, we will be in a resurrected body, and we will not be the servants of heaven or the messengers of heaven. We will be the inheritors of heaven. It will be much better. And he says, okay, let's take it at the bottom. Verse 26, and as touching the dead, that they rise, have ye not read in the book of Moses how, and this is very important, how in the bush God spake unto him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Thee therefore do greatly err. You're greatly in error. And what's he saying there? I believe he's quoting from Exodus 3 and 4, when Moses on the backside of the desert looking after the flock of his father-in-law, and he sees a burning bush on the mountain, and it's not being consumed. He says, well, I will go see this great sight. He goes up there, and it's the voice of God saying, Moses, take off your shoes, for the ground you're on is holy ground, right? And the voice coming out of the bush was the voice of God. And over and over and over in that interaction with Moses, God says, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He says, but did Moses say, well, those guys are dead. They're gone. And God says, no, they are alive, and they are better than alive. I am the God of the living, not God of the dead. So Jesus is pointing out to the Sadducees, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are alive right now in the afterlife. Their life did not expiate or expire upon death, but they're living in a land fairer than day with God himself. And he shuts their mouth with this truth, I think I can give you a few scriptures about the Old Testament. Here it is. If you go over to Job 19, verses 25 through 27. Now, this is in the Old Testament, and these were available to the Sadducees to read, but yet they did not read these, and if they did, they didn't believe that. They didn't believe the Scriptures. In Job chapter 19 and verse 25 through 27, Job writes, "For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth." And here's this language of the resurrection, even in the Old Testament. "And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins or my strength be consumed within me." You can also go look at Isaiah chapter 26, verse 19, and Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. And you can go over there. The Old Testament was packed with truth about the resurrection, about life after death, about the afterlife. So, therefore, in Mark chapter 12, Jesus shuts the mouth of the Sadducees. All right, so he shuts down the formers of the grand conspiracy, the chief priests and the scribes. He shuts down the Pharisees. He shuts down the Sadducees. And what's left is this lone scribe who's been very affected by what Jesus said. And if he was affected by what Jesus says, that's evidence that he's a child of God, as we'll see. Verse 28. Matthew 12, verse 28. "And one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together," so he heard the Pharisees and Jesus, he heard the Sadducees and Jesus, and having heard them reasoning together, and perceiving that he had answered them well, that's an understatement, asked Jesus, "Which is the first commandment of all?" And Jesus answered him, "The first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, with all thy strength." This is the first commandment. "And the second is like namely this, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. For there is none other commandment that greater than these." In fact, in other accounts, the Scriptures tell us upon these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So if you want to really condense God's law down, condense it to these two commandments. And look at verse 32. "And the scribe said unto him, Well, master, thou hast said the truth. For there is one God, and there is none other but He. And to love Him with all the heart, with all the understanding, and with all the soul, and all the strength, to love his neighbor as himself is more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." That was a risky thing to say among these people. Verse 34, "And when Jesus saw that he had answered discreetly, he said unto him, Thou art not far from the kingdom of God. And no man after that dared ask him any questions." Isaac?